The most devastating intelligence breach in the history of the Cold War was not discovered by the CIA, the NSA, or a master counterintelligence team. It was discovered by an alcoholic wife sitting in a cold apartment with a telephone in her hand. November 20th, 1984. Hyannis, Massachusetts. The wind coming off the Atlantic rattled the windows of the cramped apartment where Barbara Walker sat alone. She wasn't just a bitter ex-spouse. She was a woman who had spent 15 years living in a domestic prison built on terror and cheap vodka. To her neighbors, she was just the lady down the hall who drank too much. To her ex-husband, she was a loose end he had forgotten to cut. But that night, the fear that had silenced her for a decade was replaced by a cold, clarifying rage. She picked up the phone and dialed the local FBI office. When the duty agent answered, he heard the slurred, frantic voice of a woman claiming her ex-husband had been selling secrets to the Russians for 17 years. It was the kind of call the FBI received constantly broken marriages spilling over into vindictive fantasies. The agent listened with polite skepticism as she described her ex-husband, John Walker, a retired Navy Warrant Officer running a private detective agency in Virginia, a man who wore a toupee and drove a van. It sounded ridiculous. But then, Barbara said something that made the agent sit up straight. She didn't just say secrets. She talked about key lists and rotor settings. She described the specific, ritualistic way he photographed documents in the trunk of his car in the woods. These weren't the ravings of a drunk. They were the observations of a witness. The agent didn't know it yet, but he had just taken the call that would end the Soviet Union's total dominance of the Atlantic intelligence war. To understand why Barbara made that call, and why it took her so long, we have to look at the man who put her in that position. John Anthony Walker, Jr. was not a conflicted intellectual or a master strategist. He was a man driven by the banality of greed. He ran his treason like a franchise business, eventually dragging his friends, his brother, and even his own son into a spy ring that would rot the U.S. Navy from the inside out. But it began with just him. The story starts in 1967 in Norfolk, Virginia. Walker was a communications watch officer on the USS Simon Bolivar, a nuclear-armed submarine. He held a top-secret crypto clearance. Imagine a submarine deep underwater, invisible to the world. Its only link to command is a stream of encrypted messages. Walker was the man who held the keys to decode those messages. If a nuclear war started, the order would pass through his hands. But Walker didn't care about the apocalypse. He cared about his failing bar in South Carolina and his mounting debts. He felt the world owed him a living that his Navy salary couldn't provide. On a gray afternoon in late 1967, Walker made a decision that would alter the strategic balance of the Cold War. He stole a key list, the daily code settings for the KL-47 encryption machine, put it in his pocket, and drove to Washington, D.C. He didn't have a plan. He simply looked up the Soviet embassy in the phone book, walked up to the gate, and asked to speak to security. It was audacious, almost suicidal. But when he produced the key list, the Soviets realized this was not a prank. They ushered him in. Walker made his pitch. He would sell the Navy's encryption keys for a monthly salary. He didn't want ideology. He wanted cash. The KGB accepted, gave him a stack of bills, and sent him back to the fleet. The damage was immediate and catastrophic. To understand what Walker sold, imagine that the U.S. Navy is a house with an unpickable lock. The Soviets had spent millions trying to break down the door. Walker simply made a copy of the key and handed it to them. For the next 17 years, the Soviet Union was effectively CCD on the U.S. Navy's secret mail. They learned the precise locations of American nuclear submarines. They learned the patrol routes of attack subs designated to hunt them. They learned the technical limits of American sonar. Admiral Bobby Inman later admitted that Walker's betrayal wiped out the U.S. naval advantage, and allowed the Soviets to build quieter, deadlier submarines years ahead of schedule. But Walker wasn't satisfied with doing the dirty work alone. He needed to expand. Over the years, he turned his espionage into a family business. He recruited his older brother, Arthur, a retired lieutenant commander. He recruited his best friend, Jerry Whitworth, a senior radio man. And in the ultimate act of narcissism, he recruited his own son, Michael, a young sailor on the USS Nimitz. He groomed them, manipulated them, and turned them into assets to increase his own payout. At home, however, the master spy was a domestic tyrant. Barbara Walker discovered his secret early on. When she confronted him about a stash of unexplained cash, he admitted everything. He told her he was working for the Russians. When she threatened to go to the police, Walker didn't panic. He weaponized her love for her children. He told her that if she turned him in, she would be arrested as an accomplice, and the children would be thrown into the foster system. He painted a picture of the KGB coming to kill the entire family if the operation was exposed. He trapped her in a cage of complicity. Barbara began to drink to survive the reality of sleeping next to a traitor. She even accompanied him on runs to drop sites, sitting paralyzed in the car while he left bags of secrets in the Maryland woods. By 1976, they had divorced. Walker moved to Norfolk to live on a sailboat, playing the role of the flashy private eye, wearing gold chains and hairpieces, spending his blood money. Barbara was left in poverty, cleaning houses to survive. Walker, in his arrogance, assumed he had broken her spirit completely. He refused to pay her alimony. He taunted her poverty while he lived the high life. He believed she was too scared and too broken to ever fight back. He was wrong. The fear that had silenced her was slowly calcifying into hatred. And when she realized he had dragged their son, Michael, into the ring, putting her boy in the crosshairs of a treason charge, the balance tipped. When the FBI agents in Norfolk received the report from Hyannis, they opened a file. They knew John Walker. He was a local character, a bit sleazy, a bit loud. But the specific technical details Barbara had provided the rotors, the drop schedules, the photography methods matched the profile of a professional spy. The FBI realized this wasn't just a domestic dispute. They were looking at a hole in the Navy security that had been bleeding for nearly 2 decades. They put Walker under surveillance. They learned he had a run scheduled for May. They needed to catch him in the act. The trap was set, but it was built entirely on the word of the woman John Walker had dismissed as a drunk. The angry wife was about to bring down the whole network. The FBI operation to catch John Walker was codenamed Windflyer, and it required a level of manpower usually reserved for organized crime bosses or domestic terrorists. By May 1985, the Bureau had mobilized over 100 agents, surveillance aircraft, and chase cars, all focused on a single man driving a Chevy Astro van. They knew from Barbara's tip that Walker had a run scheduled for the weekend of May 19th. This was the moment of truth. If he simply went sailing or visited his mother, the investigation would stall. But if he drove into the woods of Maryland with a bag full of secrets, the government would finally have the evidence to lock him away for life. Attention was palpable because the FBI was essentially betting its reputation on the word of a bitter ex-wife against a 17-year veteran of the intelligence game. On the morning of May 19th, Walker left his home in Norfolk. To the casual observer, he looked like a man going on a Sunday drive, but to the team of agents trailing him, his behavior was immediately suspicious. Walker was arrogant, but he wasn't sloppy. He spent hours dry cleaning his route, driving in circles, pulling abrupt U-turns, stopping on the side of the road to watch for following cars. He drove north toward Washington, D.C., leading a convoy of FBI vehicles on a dizzying game of cat and mouse through the Virginia suburbs. The agents had to constantly switch cars and rely on a spotter plane circling high above to keep him in sight without burning their cover. It was a testament to Walker's paradox. He was a sleazy, toupee-wearing private eye who treated espionage like a side hustle, yet he possessed the discipline of a seasoned operative. As evening fell, Walker crossed into the rural darkness of Montgomery County, Maryland. This was his hunting ground. He navigated the back roads by memory, looking for the prearranged signal site. His instructions from the KGB were precise. Place a 7-Up can at the base of a specific utility pole. This was the signal that he was loaded and ready to make the drop. Walker stopped his van, placed the can, and drove on. High above, the FBI aircraft captured the moment. On the ground, agents confirmed the signal. The exchange was on. Walker then drove deep into the woods to the actual drop site, a lonely bend in a dirt road. He stopped, grabbed a brown paper grocery bag from the van, and tucked it behind a tree. It looked like trash, a common piece of litter in the countryside, but inside that bag were 129 classified Navy documents stolen from the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz. Walker got back in his van and drove to a nearby spot to wait for his payment. The protocol was simple. The KGB officer would pick up the grocery bag, inspect the goods, and leave a package of cash in a different location for Walker to retrieve. Walker parked and waited, and waited. What he didn't know was that the woods were alive with FBI agents. They were dressed in camouflage, using night vision goggles, watching his every move. But they were also watching the KGB. A Soviet diplomat named Alexei Kachenko had been spotted in the area, driving a car with diplomatic plates. Kachenko was the handler. He had driven past the drop site, but he had spooked. Maybe he saw a reflection. Maybe he sensed the surveillance. Or maybe it was just the paranoia of the trade. But Kachenko aborted. He never stopped to pick up the bag. He drove straight back to the Soviet embassy, leaving his star asset alone in the woods. Walker waited for hours. When he went to check the payment site, it was empty. Confused and anxious, he drove back to the drop site to retrieve the grocery bag. A spy's cardinal rule is never to retrieve a dropped package, but Walker was greedy. He wasn't going to leave his merchandise in the dirt if he wasn't getting paid. He grabbed the bag, threw it back in his van, and drove to a Ramada Inn to sleep off the frustration, assuming it was just a scheduling mix-up. He had no idea that the FBI had watched the entire failed transaction. They hadn't arrested him in the woods because they wanted to catch the Soviet handler too, but once Kachenko fled, the priority shifted. They couldn't let Walker leave that hotel with the documents. At 3:30 a.m., the phone rang in Walker's hotel room. It was the front desk clerk, actually an FBI agent, telling him there had been an accident involving his van. Walker, groggy and wearing a robe, grabbed his .38 caliber snub-nose revolver and went to the door. He peered through the peephole, saw nothing, and stepped into the hallway. FBI! Drop the gun. The shout came from everywhere. 2 agents with drawn weapons were waiting. Walker hesitated for a split second, perhaps calculating the odds of a shootout, before dropping the gun and raising his hands. Even in that moment, his arrogance held. He tried to bluff. He told them he was a private investigator on a case. He demanded to know why he was being harassed. But the bluff evaporated when agents opened the back of his van and found the grocery bag. Inside, they found the family jewels of the U.S. Navy. There were confidential messages regarding the deployment of nuclear weapons. There were technical manuals for the encryption machines used on the Nimitz. And there was a dear friend letter written by Walker to his Soviet handlers, detailing the morale of the sailors and suggesting future targets. It was a smoking gun of treason, handwritten and signed with his code name. The FBI had the documents, they had the gun, and they had the man. But the arrest of John Walker was just the first domino. The FBI knew he wasn't working alone. The documents in the bag had come from the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz, which was currently deployed in the Mediterranean. John Walker had been retired for years. He couldn't have stolen them. The source had to be his son, Michael. The focus of the operation instantly shifted thousands of miles away to the deck of a nuclear aircraft carrier at sea. The Naval Investigative Service, NIS, was alerted. They needed to secure Michael Walker before he heard about his father's arrest and destroyed evidence or, worse, tried to defect or sabotage the ship. Michael was a 22-year-old yeoman third class, a kid who worked in the ship's administration office. He had access to the burn bag, the secure trash, where classified documents were supposed to be destroyed. Instead of shredding them, he had been stuffing them into his shirt and carrying them back to his bunk. On the Nimitz, the ship's captain summoned Michael to his quarters. It was a terrifyingly quiet confrontation. Agents searched Michael's bunk. Hidden beneath his mattress, they found 15 pounds of classified material waiting for the next family reunion. They found a stash of cash. Michael crumbled almost immediately. He wasn't a hardened ideological spy. He was a weak young man who had been manipulated by a domineering father. He confessed that John had turned him into a thief, paying him a fraction of what the secrets were worth, and telling him it was a harmless game to screw the government. The betrayal was generational. John Walker hadn't just sold his country. He had sold his son's future for a few $1,000s. Back in the interrogation room in Baltimore, John Walker was trying to negotiate. He still thought he was the smartest guy in the room. He offered to trade information for leniency. He tried to frame his spying as a way to test the system, but the FBI agents weren't buying it. They laid out the timeline. They showed him the surveillance photos. And then they played their trump card. They told him about Barbara. The look on Walker's face must have been one of pure, unadulterated shock. He had spent years terrorizing her, convinced she was too weak, too drunk, and too dependent to ever turn on him. He had underestimated the one person who knew him best. The pathetic ex-wife had just orchestrated the most successful counterintelligence sting in FBI history. As the news of the arrest broke, the magnitude of the breach sent shockwaves through the Pentagon. Admiral James Watkins, the chief of naval operations, was briefed that the Soviets likely had the keys to decrypt naval communications going back nearly 2 decades. This wasn't just a leak. It was a total compromise. Every submarine patrol, every strategic plan, every technological advance in sonar had been exposed. The Navy realized they had been playing poker with a mirror behind their back. They had to assume the Soviets knew everything. The cost to fix the damage, to change the codes, replace the machines, and alter the strategies was estimated at over $1 billion. But the FBI wasn't done. They knew there were other members of the ring. Walker's brother, Arthur, and his friend, Jerry Whitworth, were still out there. The Windflyer operation morphed into a nationwide manhunt to roll up the rest of the network before they could run. John Walker, realizing his world had collapsed, made a cold calculation. He decided to turn on his friends to save himself. He began to talk, and as he spilled the secrets of his operation, the true depth of his banality was revealed. He hadn't built a spy ring on ideology or principle. He had built it on the exploitation of weak men who needed money. He was a predator who had fed on the insecurities of everyone around him, until the one victim he ignored finally bit back. The franchise was closed for business. With John Walker in handcuffs and his son Michael detained in the brig of an aircraft carrier, the FBI turned its attention to the other branches of the family tree. John Walker had rolled over on his accomplices with a speed that disgusted even the federal prosecutors. He didn't protect his brother. He didn't protect his best friend. He treated their identities as currency, trading them in the hope of buying a slightly smaller prison cell. The first target was his older brother, Arthur Walker. Arthur was a tragic, almost pathetic figure in the ring. A retired Navy lieutenant commander, he was working for a defense contractor in Virginia, shuffling papers in a cubicle. He wasn't a master spy. He was a man who couldn't say no to his domineering younger brother. John had recruited him with a simple pitch. You have access to old files? I have a buyer. Arthur had sold out his country for a pittance, sometimes as little as $500 a document. When the FBI agents walked into his office, Arthur didn't run. He didn't fight. He practically exhaled the confession. He admitted that he had been photographing damage control manuals and amphibious warfare reports. He was a man drowning in mediocrity, caught in a treason he barely had the energy to commit. But the real prize and the real danger was on the West Coast. Jerry Whitworth was John Walker's best friend, a retired senior chief radioman who had spent years at sea managing the communications centers of aircraft carriers like the USS Constellation and the USS Enterprise. Unlike Arthur, who stole low-level manuals, Whitworth had access to the cryptographic Holy Grail. He had provided the key lists for the KW-7 encryption machines for years. He was the reason the Soviets could read the Pacific Fleet's mail. Whitworth was living in California, trying to retire in peace, living in a trailer and hoping the past would stay buried. He had actually tried to quit the ring years earlier, paralyzed by paranoia, writing anonymous letters to the FBI offering to expose a spy ring, but never following through. When the news of Walker's arrest hit the television, Whitworth must have felt the blood drain from his face. He knew John. He knew that John would sell him out in a heartbeat, and he was right. The FBI descended on Whitworth's trailer. They found a man who was already broken by guilt and fear. But unlike the Walkers, Whitworth didn't confess immediately. He lawyered up. This set the stage for the most surreal courtroom drama of the Cold War. John Walker, the mastermind, agreeing to testify against his best friend in exchange for a lighter sentence for his son. The plea bargain was a masterpiece of legal cynicism. John Walker agreed to plead guilty and cooperate fully. In exchange, he demanded that his son, Michael, receive a sentence of no more than 25 years. He was willing to die in prison himself, serving a life sentence, but he wanted a light at the end of the tunnel for the boy he had corrupted. It was a singular act of fatherhood from a man who had otherwise failed as a father in every conceivable way. The prosecutors agreed. They needed Walker's testimony to nail Whitworth, who was facing a mountain of evidence but refusing to fold. The trial of Jerry Whitworth in San Francisco was a spectacle. John Walker took the stand, not as a defendant, but as the star witness for the government. He wore a calm, almost bored expression as he detailed how he had recruited his best friend. He described their meetings in bars, the envelopes of cash, the handoffs of crypto keys. He destroyed Whitworth with a sociopathic coolness. He admitted that Whitworth had tried to get out, and that he, Walker, had bullied him back in. He painted himself as the villain to ensure Whitworth was painted as the accomplice. It worked. The jury convicted Whitworth of espionage. He was sentenced to 365 years in prison. He would die there. But the courtroom theatrics were a sideshow compared to the damage assessment going on behind closed doors at the Pentagon. As Walker explained the technical details of what he had stolen, the admirals realized the situation was worse than their darkest nightmares. This wasn't just about reading emails. Walker had given the Soviets the ability to understand the acoustic signature of American submarines. The Cold War at sea was a game of hide and seek. American submarines were quieter than Soviet ones, giving the U.S. a massive strategic advantage. But Walker had provided the technical manuals that explained exactly how the U.S. tracked Soviet subs. He gave them the maintenance logs of the encryption machines. He gave them the tech manuals that explained the logic of the KW-R-37 receivers. Armed with this knowledge, the Soviets realized exactly why their submarines were being tracked. They immediately changed their designs. They retrofitted their propellers, dampened their engines, and changed their patrol tactics. In a matter of years, the noise gap between the two navies closed. American sonar operators, who used to be able to hear a Soviet sub from miles away, suddenly found the oceans going quiet. A Soviet defector, Vitaly Yurchenko, later confirmed that the KGB considered the Walker Ring to be the greatest intelligence coup in their history. He said, "We could read your naval orders before your captains read them." If a war had broken out in the late 70s, the Soviet Navy would have known the location of every U.S. carrier battle group. They could have launched preemptive strikes that would have crippled the American ability to project power. John Walker hadn't just sold paper. He had sold the safety of the entire Western alliance. The scale of the betrayal forced the U.S. Navy to spend an estimated $1 billion in 1980s money to replace every cryptographic machine, reissue every code, and rewrite every tactical manual. It was a logistical hurricane. Every ship, every submarine, every shore station had to be purged. The Walker tax, as it was grimly called, was paid by the American taxpayer for a decade. And through it all, Barbara Walker watched from her small apartment. The woman who had been dismissed as a drunk had triggered a billion-dollar renovation of the U.S. military. She had stopped the bleeding, but there was no joy in her victory. Her son, Michael, was going to prison for 25 years. Her ex-husband was gone for life. The family was destroyed. She had burned down the house to save the neighborhood, but she was still standing in the ashes. The media descended on her, asking why she waited so long. She told them the truth. "I didn't want to hurt my children." It was a tragic irony that in the end, saving the country required sacrificing her son. John Walker, sitting in his cell, seemed immune to the tragedy. He gave interviews to journalists, preening for the cameras, seemingly proud of his notoriety. He framed himself as a clever businessman who had simply exploited a market inefficiency. He never showed remorse for the sailors whose lives he had endangered. He only showed regret that he got caught. He was the banality of evil personified, a man who would sell the apocalypse for a sailboat and then complain about the taxes. But the final twist in the Walker saga wasn't legal or military. It was personal. The ring was broken. The spies were in prison, but the psychological wreckage left behind was vast. The Walker case changed the way the U.S. military looked at its own people. It ended the era of trust. It birthed a new era of intrusive background checks, financial monitoring, and the realization that the man with the top-secret clearance and the American flag on his desk might just be waiting for a divorce to turn him into a traitor. The insider threat was no longer a theoretical concept. It had a face, a toupee, and a Chevy van. And it had been hiding in plain sight for 17 years. The sentencing of the Walker spy ring in late 1986 was the closing act of a legal drama, but it was merely the beginning of a strategic nightmare that would haunt the U.S. Navy for decades. In a federal courtroom in Baltimore, John Walker stood before the judge, wearing a hairpiece and a smirk, and received his life sentence. Under the terms of his plea deal, he would be eligible for parole in 10 years, a clause that outraged the naval officers who sat in the gallery. His son, Michael, stood beside him, weeping, and received his negotiated 25-year sentence. But the harshest hammer fell on Jerry Whitworth in San Francisco. Without the protection of a plea deal, and with his best friend John testifying against him, Whitworth was sentenced to 365 years in prison, with no possibility of parole for 60 years. The judge called him a modern-day Benedict Arnold. Whitworth would eventually die in a federal prison in 2011, a man erased by the secrets he had sold. While the spies were being shipped off to the penitentiary system, the U.S. Navy was left to grapple with the terrifying silence of the oceans. For decades, American submarine superiority had relied on the fact that Soviet subs were noisy. They clanked and hummed, suffering from cavitation, the formation of bubbles around a spinning propeller that pop and create noise. U.S. sonar operators could track a Soviet sub from hundreds of miles away. But in the early 1980s, right around the time the Walker Ring was most active, that changed. New classes of Soviet submarines, like the Akula and the improved Victor III, began to slide into the Atlantic with a terrifying quietness. They were suddenly ghosts. The Navy initially thought this was just natural technological progression. But the Walker debriefings revealed the sickening truth. John Walker had told the Soviets exactly why they were being tracked. He had handed them the technical analysis of their own noise signatures. Armed with Walker's stolen diagnostics, the Soviet naval engineers realized their propellers were the problem. They initiated a crash program to acquire advanced milling machinery eventually, sourcing it illegally from Japan's Toshiba and Norway's Kongsberg in a separate but related scandal to build silent propellers. The result was the Walker Gap. The acoustic advantage that the U.S. had banked on for deterrence evaporated. In a war scenario, American attack submarines would no longer be able to guarantee they could find and sink Soviet missile subs before they launched. The balance of terror had shifted. The Navy had to redesign its entire anti-submarine warfare doctrine, developing expensive new, active sonar systems and magnetic anomaly detectors to compensate for the fact that they could no longer simply listen for the clanking engines. The Walker tax wasn't just the cost of replacing crypto machines. It was the cost of a more dangerous world. The scandal also triggered a brutal purge within the American security establishment. 1985 became known as the year of the spy, as the government, panicked by the Walker revelations, began shaking the trees to see what else fell out. They found Jonathan Pollard selling to Israel, Ronald Pelton selling to the Soviets, and Larry Wu Tai Chin selling to China. The illusion of loyalty was shattered. In response, the Department of Defense mandated a massive expansion of the polygraph program. Before Walker, lie detector tests were rare for clearance holders. After Walker, they became routine. The number of people holding top-secret clearances was slashed by the millions. The two-person rule, which required 2 people to be present whenever classified material was handled, was strictly enforced. The era of the gentleman's agreement in officer wardrooms was over. Every sailor was now a potential suspect, and every piece of paper was tracked with the paranoia that John Walker had necessitated. But amidst the geopolitical fallout, the personal tragedy of the Walker family reached its quiet, sad conclusion. John Walker spent the rest of his life in the federal prison system, eventually dying in a hospital unit in North Carolina in 2014. At the age of 77, he never expressed genuine remorse. In interviews from prison, he continued to frame himself as a rogue hero, a man who had outsmarted the system, blaming his family for his downfall. He remained a narcissist to the end, unable to comprehend that his legacy was not brilliance, but betrayal. His son, Michael, served 15 years of his sentence and was released in 2000. He walked out of prison a middle-aged man, his youth consumed by his father's greed. He changed his name, moved to a quiet town, and vanished into anonymity, trying to wash off the stain of being a Walker. And then there was Barbara. The woman who started it all received no ticker-tape parade. The FBI gave her a portion of the reward money, but it was a fraction of what was promised, and it did little to heal the scars of the past. She lived the rest of her life in relative obscurity on Cape Cod, struggling with the demons of the past, but maintaining a quiet dignity. She had done the hardest thing a mother can do. She had sacrificed her son's freedom to save his soul and to protect her country. In the intelligence community, Barbara Walker is regarded as an unsung hero, a civilian who showed more courage than the men in uniform who had ignored the warning signs for years. She proved that the strongest counterintelligence tool is not a computer algorithm or a satellite, but a conscience. The legacy of the John Walker case is a permanent scar on the American psyche. It ended the innocence of the Cold War. It proved that treason doesn't require a dark ideology or a tortured philosophy. It doesn't require a manifesto. It just requires a man with an ego, a van, and a desire for a sailboat. Walker demonstrated that the insider threat is the most dangerous weapon in any arsenal, because it is invisible until it is too late. He showed that you can spend billions on fences, locks, and missiles, but you cannot engineer a defense against human greed. Today, every time a Navy sailor sits down for a periodic security review, every time a background investigator interviews a neighbor about a federal employee's drinking habits, and every time a document is logged into a secure computer system, the ghost of John Walker is present. The system is designed to catch the next Walker, the next mediocre man who thinks he is smarter than the world. But the ultimate lesson of the case remains the one that the FBI learned on that cold night in November 1984, when the billion-dollar security apparatus fails, when the admirals are blind and the agents are looking the wrong way. The safety of the nation might just rest in the trembling hands of an angry wife with a telephone.